module, Brian and Hsu Ken discuss their personal motivations for starting a startup, and they explored both the good and the bad reasons to start a startup. In module 2, we covered common misconceptions that keep people from starting a startup, like you need the perfect billion-dollar idea or you need loads of money. Brian and Hsu Ken debunk them, and they gave advice on how to overcome these misconceptions. The third module, Brian and Hsu Ken explored what qualities matter most for founders, and if these aren't natural for you, how to develop them. Hsu Ken, do you remember what excited you the most about starting a startup?
Yeah, I do remember. I don't know if there was like one thing, but I feel like it's like one of those things in life where it was like everything that I kind of like learned about startups just seemed like was very exciting for me. I mean, even to the point, June and Pranav, we've talked about this. For everybody on the call, when people join Iterative, I should start this back up again. We buy them a book, and we buy them Jessica Livingston's book, which is Founders at Work, and because it's a good encapsulation, kind of like what there you go, what the actual experience is like. And honestly, most of the stories in it are horrible. It's just like people just like just going through very difficult times. And I remember when I read the book and about all these people going through very difficult times, I just was like super excited. I was like, oh, I got to do this, which is kind of like a weird reaction when the whole book is about how horrible everything is. And then my reaction was like, I need to do this. That was kind of like the thing. It just seemed like such an adventure. And these people were like living kind of like doing interesting stuff and all of this. And so I just wanted to be like one of these people and like have these kinds of experiences. And so for me, it was very much just like, this seems like such a fun adventure. Like I want to do it. And by the way, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what was entailed. I didn't know any of that kind of stuff. So it just seemed very exciting to me.
Was there a moment, do you remember, or was it just like a series of things?
A moment of what?
Of like that made you decide you want to start something?
Oh, no, I actually, this is an interesting kind of like thing. Um, it's like one of those things that I feel like I had made the decision to start a startup without knowing it. And then it was like my subconscious notified me. Like, I think a lot of times when you're like making decisions in life, you're kind of like, okay, what are the pros and cons? And what should I do here? And it's like very kind of like, you're like thinking about this thing. And at least for startups, it was like one of those times where it was like, I think somebody asked me whether I was going to start a startup. And like the answer that came out of my mouth before I realized anything was just yes. And I was like, oh, I guess this is the thing I'm doing. And so, there was very little kind of debate. It was almost just kind of like, it was like decided for me. And it was like, I was informed that this was something that I was going to do.
So some people said, I'm excited about applying the business skills I've learned in FMCG
Yeah.
marketing, excited about building my own brand and finding ways to grow a business. Somebody wrote, the future is not written. It's like you're in a game and the ending is
Yeah.
open. You take full responsibility of what could happen. Somebody else answered, best shot at reaching an 8-figure net worth, and solving a problem for a market I genuinely care about. Oh, interesting that that's the secondary. And then a couple of other ones, finding new solutions for old problems that people haven't thought of before, explore creative ways to solve problems. It seems fun. And then creating an impact aligned with my purpose beyond profits, which is helping people live happier, more fulfilling lives. Any quick reactions, Hsu Ken?
Maybe my reactions are, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I feel like these are kind of like typical kind of like reasons that people kind of like have for starting startups. And I think mostly kind of people are kind of like being quite honest. Like the person was like, hey, this is kind of like the best chance to kind of get to 8 figures. I was like debating in my head whether I think this is the best like chance of kind of like 8 figures or not. It's certainly kind of like I mean, it's a debate, but I think that's like kind of not reasonable. I think so. I think all of this kind of stuff is not surprising to me. I think the thing that being a founder is going to put to the test is how much you care about these things. And so I think there's like some of these pieces where it's kind of like, okay, you may think you kind of care about it a lot, and then when you're in your like, I don't know, 6 month of can't get anybody to sign up for my product, you'll find out if you really got what you really gotta like care about this. But none of this is kind of like super kind of surprising. There's a bit of like people are interested in a problem, people kind of want to see what the journey is like. There's some monetary stuff. I don't think it's like super surprising.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, like the this one, the future is not written thing. Yeah, I think just because you are the owner of
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to kind of elaborate more on this, I mean, whoever wrote this, to me, the way that I read this is this person wants to take uh, full control of their agency. And so they're like, hey, I only have my agency is constrained working at kind of like a large company. But, you know, if I do my own startup, it's like, it's going to go as far as I can kind of like take it and stuff, right? So there's no constraints. I mean, there's also kind of no safety net. So it kind of goes both ways, but it's kind of like he wants to grasp his agency and being like, okay, I'm gonna like do this thing, which is cool. Like, you know, I think there's a part of it that kind of I felt probably similar. But I can relate to kind of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe not the 8-figure one, just because part of me was like, I never at any point during kind of like starting a startup was I like, this is going to work. And so
Yeah.
not that there's anything wrong with that. I just never like I didn't allow myself to like daydream about that kind of.
Yeah. By the way, whoever wrote that, we're not calling you out. Like,
No, it's fine.
yeah, completely valid.
Fine.
Because you're
Yeah.
just thinking things in real time.
Yeah.
Being a founder, you deal with failure all the time. How do you guys deal with failure in general? Hsu Ken, why are you laughing?
I just laughed because as soon as I read this question, my immediate reaction was I sighed deeply, which I think is most founders' reactions to kind of like when they think about kind of like their own failures and how they dealt with it is just like honestly, I didn't even think about it. I like read the question and I was like, oh, like and so
How do you deal with failure, Hsu Ken?
I will tell everybody that the maybe the this is going to sound hyperbolic, but it's actually it's probably not that far off. Um, I think maybe one of the best things to happen to me was complete and utter failure early in life. Like, I think the first startup, which went absolutely nowhere, and it was a complete and utter failure. And I say complete and utter failure because I think people hedge sometimes where they're like if you don't go to school, if you don't go to classes, and you don't do well in the like in that class, you're kind of like, well, I didn't go to the classes, right? Like I didn't try that hard. That's why I didn't do well, right? And I think that first startup was the first time I'd ever tried so hard at anything in my life. Like I did everything I could, right? And it was a complete and utter failure. And so to me, like complete and utter failure is I tried as hard as I possibly could. I did everything that I like know how to do, and it failed, right? And there's nothing to blame it on. It was like me, Brian, and our brothers. Like, like who else is gonna like fail here? And so I think that was good because we did that early in life, before I kind of had much of an ego, and you're kind of young, and you can kind of like get over it. And so I think I got past that initial. It's easier after that first complete and utter failure, and then there was just like subsequent failures consistently and oftenly after that. And I think how I get over it now is I am numb. Like I have just had it so much, I am numb. Um, but it was funny. I was like, I've been doing this surfing thing in Singapore, and I'm like learning this new thing, and like there's this way to get in where you like jump on your surfboard, and I literally fell on my face 20 times in a row, and the instructor was like, "Dude, you will just like keep doing this," and I was like, man, if there's anything I will do, anything I'm good at, I will do this over and over, and I do not care how dumb I look. Like,
Yeah, that's how you get better.
I just don't care anymore, right? And so I don't know, maybe that
Yeah.
helps.
Okay, let's take a look at what people are saying. Being numb to failure is a great strategy.
I can give some practical advice. Maybe I should be like try to be helpful to people rather than being like fail so much you're numb. But yeah.
But some people have pretty good suggestions. I mean, how they deal with it, right? So just take a deep breath and think about the world with me would be better than without me. Take a long walk, cry a bit if I must, sleep, then start a new day. It's not over until you stop. Someone else said, I just deal with it. When I'm in a good mood, it's data, no failures, just lessons. When I'm in a bad mood, F word, you'll feel crappy for a few days, sleep off, try again. Some other people said, ask questions on why and what they need to do differently. So a lot of introspection. Someone else said, I feel too many times now, I understand it's part of the game. So my mentor taught me to stay in the game and avoid 100% drawdown. Someone else said, just wing it. And then when I fail, I either fight really hard the second time or I get cynical and switch off.
My immediate reactions here are, it's a weird place because I kind of want to kind of like be honest with people, but I also don't want to scare people away from entrepreneurship. And so, but those two things are kind of at odds, because if I'm being honest, it sounds scary, but it's
Mhm.
like, um, and what I mean by this is you're really going to be put to the test here, on kind of like dealing with failure. I think, again, I think, being a founder kind of like strips you naked a little bit, where it's like there's nobody else to kind of like blame. You can't blame it on your boss. You can't blame it on like, oh, the company is stupid. You can't blame it on like, oh, whose dumb idea it was, because it was your idea. Like it's kind of like all of this stuff. And so this is going to get really kind of like put to the test. Um, I think, before I just became callous and numb to the world, I think the things that, that at least I did that kind of like helped me, and, I think everybody has to kind of find their own way. There was, um, I think I learned to try to not take it kind of like personally. Like failure is a thing that happens, but that doesn't mean I'm a failure. It doesn't mean that I am kind of like suck, right? And so that, being able to differentiate those two things kind of like helped. Um, I think the other part was like, trying to understand what happened. I think sometimes people have a tendency to like, when there is kind of like failure, they just try to like kind of like look away, right? And I think, it always helped me actually to kind of like look deeper, because I feel like if I could understand kind of like why this thing kind of like failed, it just made me feel better about it. As opposed to kind of like, just looking away, and then it just kind of like haunts me kind of like forever. And then there's all the normal stuff. Like I play a lot. I used to play a lot of football and like all this other stuff. And you just try to kind of do those other things and kind of like survive through it. But I think a lot of the stuff here, I think people are kind of like talking about is, the introspection and kind of like attitudes and all that are probably, kind of the right thing to go. Maybe the last thing I'll kind of like say here is, um, it's also okay to kind of feel like, I don't know, whatever you feel about kind of whatever your emotional reaction to failure is, it's like perfectly okay. I don't think I find that I kind of like deal with it better if I'm kind of like leaning into it, rather than kind of like ignoring those emotions and stuff. And so, but I think this is something that is often talked a lot about amongst founders, but rarely talked about kind of like publicly. This is like one of those topics.
Did anything keep you from starting a startup?
Yeah, finding people to start a company, I mean,
Oh,
finding co-founders. Like to me, I was just like, I always played team sports growing up. I love kind of like, I think teams are more fun, all that kind of stuff. And so to me, it was like finding co-founders, but maybe to be more clear, it wasn't really like finding co-founders like, oh, I need an engineer or something like that. I just wanted to find literally anybody who was as into startups as I was. That's the only thing I like, which happened to be Brian, but like basically kind of like that was the only kind of like thing.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But everything else, you were like set.
I was too dumb and naive, I think, for everything else. Like all of the advice we give is the stuff that I've like learned like now, and that's the stuff I should have done in the past, but like I didn't do it in the past. So like do what I say now, but don't do what I actually did. Like all of the, Brian and I being co-founders for like 20 years and all that stuff, complete luck, like absolute dumb luck, right? So yeah. So I didn't know to be scared about all the other stuff, and I didn't know about like validating idea. I didn't know anything.
All right. Let's see what people are
Ooh.
saying. I started one recently, lots to figure out. Used to be not supportive circle, but I overcame it and started a company now. Nothing. I love it. Nothing on my way. Fear for failure, fear for not making money, personal run rate and needing to adjust my lifestyle if I don't get the funding. And I'm scared of investing time and money into something that might fail.
Maybe things that I relate to. I don't know if that's kind of like helpful. The not supportive circle, I definitely kind of relate to. Even though I started a company in like US, I wasn't in SF, and so I didn't actually know anybody that was doing startups. And so, um, I think that actually was kind of like, it just kind of like sucks to be so excited about something and then to have people not be excited, and then some people to be like negative about it. That just sucks. And so that one I can totally understand. Um, fear, failure, fear for not making money. I think I probably should have been more scared of this, but I would like kind of like was too young and dumb to kind of like worry about it. Same with personal run. By the way, guys, if you're kind of ever wondering why people seem to kind of start companies earlier on in life, is because they don't have as much of the kind of fear, and they don't have much personal run rate, and like they're just not as like worried about this stuff because they just don't have very much, and so it's kind of like a bit easier. Investing time and money into something that might fail. Again, when we started, it was like we invested a lot of time, but we had no money to invest, and so it was kind of like, so yeah. Hey, actually, one last thing on the like lifestyle thing that I think is really interesting. On some level, I would have thought that it would have been easier to start a company in Asia because more people live with their parents. So in the US, you don't live with your parents. And so you actually, your personal burn run rate is higher because you have to pay for rent, right? But a lot of people in Southeast Asia don't, they live with their parents. And so they don't have that. So I would have thought personal run rates are lower. And so then this becomes like more of a worry, but it's actually, people worry about it here much more than they do in the US. So I thought that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
There's some cultural piece of this, I think.
probably. Yeah. And also, I guess in Southeast Asia specifically, starting something is not common.
I think that's actually kind of like a big piece here where it's like, and a lot of people on the call are like thinking about doing something and they may not know anybody or have any kind of close friends who have done that. And so that definitely seems kind of like scary, right? It's like if I wanted to be an astronaut and I don't know anybody that's an astronaut and I'm kind of like, what's an
Yeah.
astronaut look like? Like, how do you become an astronaut? I don't know any of these things because like, I don't know anybody's astronaut. If your three best friends are all astronauts, you're kind of like, I might as
Yeah.
well be an astronaut, I guess, at this point, right? So it's like a much easier thing, which again is a really big benefit of San Francisco, is because like it is kind of like having your three best friends be astronauts because everybody there is kind of founders, and so it's like it's very kind of like easy to kind of just do the thing everybody else is doing.
Okay, first question, Hsu Ken. Should
Yeah,
companies align with the founder's personal vision? Is problem solving enough motivation in tough times?
maybe I'll just give kind of like a personal example. Um, I don't know if okay, I'm going to be really honest, guys. I don't know if I cared that much about any of the company's visions for any of the companies I started outside of Iterative, if I'm being really honest, right? Um, I thought it was interesting. I thought it might be good, but it wasn't like the primary reason that I like started the companies. The primary reason I started the companies was because at first it seemed like an adventure, and then the second part was it seemed like the best way to learn a lot really fast. And so my primary reason for kind of like working on startups and continuing to work on startups was, hey, this seems like a good way to kind of just like learn valuable skills and learn them very quickly, kind of painfully, but like you just learn super quick. Um, and that ended up making me quite resilient because my learning is independent of the outcome of the startup or how it's going. So the startup could kind of be going horribly, and I'm like, I'm still learning a lot, so like it's okay. And if it was going well, I'm like still learning a lot, so it's okay. So it just made me resilient. Um, I think the way that you want to kind of like think about this is what you're optimizing for is resiliency. And so as long as your kind of motivation is going to help you be resilient in those tough times, then I think you're probably okay, is maybe the way that I would talk about it. And so there are some people who are like, they care so much about what the company is doing that they're going to be quite resilient because they want to get this done, which I feel this way more about Iterative. Like I care more about what Iterative does much more than I did the other companies. And so if that helps you be resilient, great. If you really care about learning and you're kind of like, that's the reason you're doing startups and that helps you be resilient, fantastic. If you just think the whole thing is like kind of fun, then that also kind of
Yeah.
helps. But the trick is like what helps you be resilient.
Next question. Since you started your company in the US, do you think it's more difficult for founders to start a startup in Southeast Asia than in the US?
I don't know. And here's why. There's like two conflicting kind of like things here. The thing that makes it easier about starting companies in the US is there's more people that kind of like do I'll talk specifically about starting companies, but if you guys want to expand this to like successful companies, then I think it's a slightly different kind of thing. But starting companies in the US is easier because there's like more people that start companies. And if you just move to San Francisco, you're basically like surrounded by them. So on some level, it's kind of like easier. And on top of that, there's a lot of success stories. So again, it's like you just kind of know a lot of people who've been successful doing this. So it just makes it easier. So I think it's easier to like start. There's less stigma, kind of like all of this kind of stuff. So I think it's easier to kind of like start. On the flip side, Southeast Asia is easier to kind of start companies because there's way less competition. Way less, right? There's less people doing this. There's less companies kind of like fighting for stuff or whatever. Starting a company in San Francisco is like easy to start, incredibly hard to be successful because you're just competing against an entire city of people that are doing this. right? And I think in Southeast Asia, it's like there's less people that kind of like do this, and so on some level, there's just like less competition, and I think there's actually more problems to solve. So if I was gonna like pick the best kind of environment in which to start a company, I would like it would be like take all of the SF people and knowledge and transplant them in Southeast Asia's problems, because I think Southeast Asia has like the more interesting problems and more stuff to kind of solve, but doesn't kind of have kind of like the infrastructure to kind of like do it, which is hopefully what we're going to do with Iterative. So I think that's probably kind of the difference. If I think about kind of the overall difficulty of starting a startup, the difference between starting a startup in SF and Southeast Asia is like this much of the equation. Like most of the thing that is difficult about starting a startup are actually the same everywhere, which is like everywhere you fear failure, everywhere you're kind of like, is this thing going to work? Everywhere is kind of like, there's always people that are going to tell you that like, this isn't going to work. Like all of that stuff is the same everywhere.
Yeah, at its core, it's the same.
At its core, it's the same, right?
Can you share a memorable example of an iterative founder's motivations for starting their company?
We have one company, and I'll even name them. We have a company called Autodot, and they are the exact opposite of me. And what I mean by they're not the exact opposite in every way, but they're exact opposite in one clear way. I said I did not care that much about the company's visions for the companies that I originally worked on, and they care extremely deeply. They work on this education kind of product, and it was just like, I don't think I'd met founders who just like cared so much about kind of what they were doing. In fact, they cared so much. In the first office hours I had with them, I told them they needed to be better capitalists. I was like, you guys should need to care about money more. And the reason why I said this was because if you really want to do the thing that you are like trying to do, your company needs to be able to make money. Because if you can't make money, then the company doesn't survive and you like don't do this thing anyway. And they like cared so much about their thing. They like didn't care about money. They just wanted to do the thing. And I had to be like, I literally had to teach them how to be capitalists. And I was like, you guys, you got to like learn how to make some money to like in order to do this. And so I think they have this like very infectious kind of like obvious enthusiasm for like what they're working on, which honestly I wish I had kind of for like my ideas and like our ideas and that kind of stuff. But I think they are kind of the purest form of this.
Okay, this person says, I've listed down a number of ideas I could potentially pursue that I care about. Besides the reasons listed in the 3 modules, how do you filter the ideas?
Validate, which is a whole nother program and kind of course, but which you should sign up for. We have content on and all that kind of stuff. Pranav, maybe you can drop a link for people. But the trick here is, sorry, let me give a kind of short kind of like framework here. So I used to do the same thing. So I used to always have a list of like a backlog of like 40 startup ideas that like, as you work on startups, like I worked on the first startup for like 8 years. That's like over 8 years, you come up with lots of ideas you can't do anything about because you're working on a startup. And so I had this backlog of 40. I went through the 40 and I basically I tried to prioritize it based off of how big of a problem I thought it was for people and how easy I thought it was going to be to solve. And then I just picked like the top one. If you get good at this, you can do 3 at a time, but I picked the top one and then I just tried to like validate that idea, that one idea for like 2 or 3 weeks to see if I could generate any evidence of kind of like case. And if I couldn't generate any demand and nobody wanted this thing, then I moved to the next one. And if I could, then I would spend maybe another 2 weeks. And so I would just run this process of like, try to generate evidence. If cannot generate evidence, move to the next idea. If I can generate evidence, invest 2 more weeks. How do I generate even more compelling evidence? And I'm just like running this like algorithm.
Is it okay at seed stage that we are not servicing a $1 billion market, but have clear potentials for diversification or expansion, e.g. parenting education?
Yeah, let me take this kind of, let me kind of like give some caveats to this first. We are a venture capital firm. Not all companies need to be venture capital kind of like backed companies. So to me, I'm like, if your goal is to just build a business, then absolutely it's like you don't need to be servicing a $1 billion market and you don't have to worry about what venture capitalists think. You don't have to worry about any of that nonsense. So I think the first thing is like, if you're starting a business and you're not interested in venture capital, you don't have to worry about this at all. Like literally just do your thing, service your customers, you're good. If you want to be a venture capital business, you have to think about this a little bit more, but it's okay that you are not servicing $1 billion market right off the bat. So for example, it wasn't clear that Facebook was serving $1 billion market when they started. It wasn't clear that Airbnb was. And so there's lots of companies that kind of go this way. So there typically is two paths when you think about market. One is, are you serving an existing market, and is that market large? And then the really disruptive startups are, I'm serving a market that doesn't exist yet. And then the question is, well, how big is that market going to materialize, and how big is that market going to be? And so if you are in the second camp where you think there should be a market where there is not a market, then you're not gonna. Nobody will kind of see it as $1 billion market, and if you are, then it still could be okay. So yeah, I don't think this is a problem. Kind of first steps first, right? Can you find a small number of people who really want what you're making, and then you kind of build out from there. The last thing maybe the one more thing I'll say here is whether something is $1 billion market or not is actually more subjective than I think everybody kind of like realizes. So if you ask me whether something is $1 billion market or not, I might think it is, and I could be wrong. I could be right. I don't know. So like June could think it's $1 billion market. It's going to be $1 billion market. I could think it's not $1 billion market, and it's actually kind of like not that clear, right? And so I think there's no kind of like obvious kind of empirical, this is $1 billion market or not, which is obviously the case, because if there was an easy test to see whether this was $1 billion market or not, like my job would be super easy, would be much easier, and then a founder's job would be much easier, because we could all just use this filter and only work on these ideas. But the reality is that like there is no filter. You don't know until you kind of like start. A funny anecdote that I have is I have a couple of friends who have started kind of $1 billion companies, including Brian. And I think the hilarious thing is none of them, almost all of them, didn't think it was $1 billion market until their company actually became worth $1 billion, and they're like, "Oh my god, I can't believe this thing's actually worth so much." So it's like totally not obvious. But by the way, in their pitches, they all said it was going to be worth $1 billion company, but inside they're like, "Yeah, I don't know, we'll see."
Okay, this person says, I'm not sure if I'm suited for the fundraising route. Which types of startups are suited for the fundraising route or bootstrap as a small business?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what you mean by kind of like suited, right? So if you're like, hey, I'm not very good at fundraising, then you can get good at fundraising. I wouldn't worry about that one too much, right? So I think if that's what you mean, you can get good at fundraising. Don't worry about it. The part about kind of like what should be bootstrapped and what should not, it depends on kind of like how big the market is and whether you need a lot of money in order to capture the market or not. So here's a good example. If you were starting a ride hailing business in Southeast Asia when all of that stuff was happening, and you did not raise venture capital, you are dead. Because that was a business that was going to be a really big business, and all of the people competing had raised like tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're going to put you out of business. So funding is just like a way to compete. It's like, okay, here's a bunch of resources so that you can compete with everybody, right? So the businesses that typically are going to need funding are the ones that working in markets that are worth a lot of money, kind of like billions and billions of dollars and that kind of stuff, because venture capitalists will put money into those businesses. In order for you to compete, you typically need to be able to have kind of like a somewhat kind of proportional amount of money. For the bootstrap small businesses, it also depends on the type of like life you want to have. If you want to build a business slowly, kind of over a longer period of time, and by the way, I'm not saying that as a negative. I actually think that's quite nice. And you don't have to answer to investors. You don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. Then the bootstrap way might work. And as long as that bootstrap business is probably not something where, I don't know, it's not like the ride hailing business where some huge person is going to come in and kind of like eat your lunch, right? So yeah, I think it depends on what kind of business you want to start. Do you want to do the like venture capital roller coaster of a couple of years, and it's kind of all consuming and kind of all, and you either make it big or you die, or you can take the other one where it's more in your control. It's not like make it or die. It's like you kind of are building on. So it's up to you. But it has to do with kind of market size and kind of what other people are kind of doing.
Do you think founders should have a solid financial foundation before starting a startup?
This is a total personal question to me, right? Is like, is it easier to start a startup if you have a lot of money? Yeah, of course. Like lots of things in life are easier when you have a lot of money, right? So yes, that's obviously kind of like true. Is it prohibitive though? I don't think so, right? So like, for example, when we kind of like started out, I just was spending my weekends working on my startup. So I worked a kind of regular job and all that kind of stuff. I just was spending all my free time working on a startup. And so that doesn't cost any more money or anything like that. I just was spending my free time doing that. And then I was building evidence that this was probably kind of like a good bet for me to make to work on the startup and all of that. And then, I eventually kind of like made the leap. I think that if you are thinking about quitting your job to do the startup, then I think you want to first do some validation so that you have some evidence that like this is likely a good idea. By the way, uh, you telling me your idea and me saying it's a good idea is not evidence that it's a good idea. Like I'm just like a dude with an opinion. Like real evidence is like, can you get 5 people on this Zoom call to like give you money for something, right? That's worth more than like Hsu Ken thinks this is a good idea. If you are going to quit your job to kind of pursue a startup, you're going to want to have enough of a financial foundation that you can focus working on the startup without uh, too much stress in your personal life. So if I only have 3 months of runway and I'm starting a startup, that's going to be really challenging. Most startups don't get off the ground in 3 months, right? And so you're going to just feel like you're under the clock all the time. Then you're going to start getting stressed out about like how you're going to kind of like make it and all of that kind of stuff. So I think to me, I would want at least 6 months at the like bare minimum. 1 year is like probably kind of like the really kind of like good kind of like sweet spot. If I was doing this, I would put limits around kind of like spending and all of that kind of stuff to help manage, right? So I know some people when they started a startup, they like looked at all their finances and they were like, okay, cool. I actually only have enough money for 3 months, but I'm going to cut down spending on this thing, and this thing to get it to 6 months. If I don't see this much kind of like evidence or progress by 5 months, I'm going to start looking for a job. And I think that just helped them manage their psychology around kind of like, okay, I'm not going to, I'm not waking up every day being like, okay, should I like do this? What's going to happen? They had like a plan, they had a structure, they followed the plan, they followed the structure. And I think that helps people. Again, kind of a personal kind of like thing, but I think at an absolute minimum, I think it needs to be kind of like 6 months. 1 year would be good. 18 months would be fantastic. But again, not everybody can kind of like do this, right?
At what stage of their career should someone start a startup? And is it essential for a founder to achieve billion-dollar success?
Nope. There's absolutely kind of like no age or kind of like stage of career that kind of matters here. You pick any stage and there's tons of counter examples, right? So, if you think you're too young, I can quote Mark Zuckerberg. If you think you're kind of like, well, if you're like middle kind of career, I'll quote you Jeff Bezos. If you think it's later in life, I'll just quote you kind of like, I don't know, Phil Knight or somebody like that. Like you can pick founders basically at kind of like every kind of like stage of this. And so none of it is essential to being kind of like a successful founder. The interesting observation I will share with people who start companies when they're young tend to start consumer companies, and people who start companies when they're older tend to start B2B companies. The reason why this is the case is when you are young, you haven't done that much business, and so you don't know what other businesses need. But you hang out with your friends a lot, and so you want to build business. You understand kind of like social relationships a lot, so they build stuff like Instagram and kind of this kind of thing. Then as you get older, after you've worked for a while, you're like, hey, I worked in manufacturing for like 10 years. I'm going to do a startup that focuses on this part of manufacturing. And you just like wouldn't have known to start that company unless you worked in manufacturing. So different ages kind of tend to start different things, but there's no rules about this.
Essential for a founder to achieve billion-dollar success.
Nope. Nope.
Cool.
I actually don't think there's anything where I'm like, you can't achieve $1 billion success without this. Some people do it with not very much money. Some people kind of do it late in life. Some people do it, never went to college. Like, right? Yeah. So there's no like, unless you have this, you can't do it. There's no such thing.
Founder building multiple startups at once are less attractive to VCs.
100% less attractive. Of course they are. That's like asking like, hey, if I come work for your company, am I less attractive if I work 3 other jobs too? And it's like, yeah, you're less attractive. Like I want you to only work for me. And it's the same for kind of like VCs. Like running a startup and being successful is like so hard if that was the only thing that you did. And most people, and like almost everybody fails doing that. So the idea that like somebody can be successful running multiple ones is just like insane. So we actually have a rule, like we don't invest in people who run multiple startups. We're like, which one is your one?
Do you believe it's more difficult for Southeast Asian founders to pitch unconventional ideas compared to US founders?
I would be, I'll try to answer. I would be very curious why people think this is the case. And so maybe kind of in chat, like, I don't, you don't have to like, if you're not comfortable, whatever, but I would be curious in chat if other people feel this way and why they think this is the case. Because this is not obvious to me. I don't think it's as much about Southeast Asia founders and US founders. I actually think it's Southeast Asia investors and US investors. US investors have much more risk tolerance than Southeast Asia investors. And so really unconventional ideas, kind of like US investors would be like, huh. Like I think a good example of this is I think in the US, if you pitch investors and your idea is not unconventional enough, they'll be like, it's never gonna be, it's not that big of a deal. Like it's just too conventional. Like it's not interesting. Whereas I feel like in Southeast Asia, it's kind of like the reverse, where it's like, oh, it's too unconventional. Like I wouldn't invest in it. And so I think it's actually more about the investors kind of than that. Um, for the founder side, I guess this is, I mean, I can take a guess. I'm like, I'm also from kind of like Southeast Asia. I guess this is like a cultural thing about like putting yourself out there and kind of failure and that kind of stuff. I guess if you believe that Southeast Asian founders are more afraid of failure than US founders, then pitching unconventional ideas is probably going to be harder for them because psychologically they're going to be like, they fear kind of the failure more, and unconventional ideas almost by definition kind of fail more. So I guess that could be true. I think the thing that I think with all of that kind of stuff is like, it's true if you believe it.
Mm.
Right. And if you don't believe it, then it's not true for you. So you actually have a choice, right? When posed with these kinds of choices, I just choose the one that's most advantageous to me. And then I just like brainwash myself into thinking that. So
What do you think are the three most important things a founder needs to prepare before applying to Iterative and to pass the interview rounds?
Pranav, I feel like I have some post that is like something that touches on this. Do you want to kind of like try to drop this somewhere? First of all, maybe kind of like I'll point out to people is that your primary goal as a startup founder is not to get into Iterative and it's not to pass the interview rounds. Your primary goal is you want to build something that's useful to a lot of people. And you do that by kind of working on an important problem and then kind of like being able to kind of like do all of this kind of stuff. And so I sometimes kind of, and I think sometimes people think of YC in this way too, where they're just like, oh my God, I just need to get into YC. I need to get into YC. I feel like people don't realize that like 99% of YC companies actually die, like they don't succeed. And so clearly getting into YC is like no kind of like, and look, they're, but to answer the question kind of directly, needs to prepare. You should look at those posts. So go read those. They're going to be a better answer than anything I kind of say.
Our startup is pre-MVP, but I want to validate if people are willing to pay for it. How do you get people to pay for something that doesn't exist yet?
If you want to do it the San Francisco way, you make them think it exists and then you charge them for it. Like that's the way that kind of most kind of like startups in the US kind of like do it, right? So and maybe there's a distinction here. You only care, you want to test whether they're willing to pay for the thing, right? And so a lot of what companies do in SF is like if I built a product for Pranav, I'm like, yeah, Pranav, you use my thing. Here's what it does. Here's what it works or whatever. Pranav's like, great. And I'd be like, okay, Pranav, it's going to be $10 a month. Pranav's like, great, I'll pay $10 a month. I send him the Stripe account. He kind of pays kind of like $10 or whatever. Now I know he will pay, right? And then my trick is like, okay, now I got to go deliver the product, right? I do think it is disingenuous to kind of like if Pranav pays money, he needs to get kind of like what I said, and so you need to kind of like go kind of put that together. But I think the important thing is to kind of understand, see if Pranav will kind of like pay for this. Maybe here's a better way to explain this through a iterative startup story. We had a company that was doing payroll automation for crypto companies. So the idea here was there was a lot of crypto companies and Web3 companies that were obviously hired people, and they wanted to pay their people in Web3 and also in fiat. So they needed so this company was like, I'm going to build this product that like does payroll for everybody, but in crypto and kind of fiat. And by payroll, it means like, hey, here's a list of everybody you're paying. Here's the amounts. You actually send them the money. There's pay slips. There's that whole thing. They join the batch, haven't built a single thing. And they're like, okay, cool. Well, it's going to take 2 months to build this thing. So should we get started? And we can cancel all the office hours. And I just laughed at them. And I was like, haha, you think you're going to build anything? Like, you're not going to build anything. But like, you probably won't build anything during the batch. All you're going to do is sell. And they had basically the same thing. So I basically forced them to go sell to people. And I was like, they're like, what do I do? And I was like, you tell them you have this product and you like see if anybody will kind of like onboard and sign and like do the work and kind of that kind of stuff. So they do this for a couple of weeks and they come back to me one day and they're like, oh my God, we have a customer. They hadn't paid yet, but they wanted to integrate. They had a client. They're like, oh my God, we have this client. They want us to do their payroll for next month, and their monthly payroll is like $1 million. They're like, what do we do? We have 3 weeks. We don't have a product. We told them we have a product, and they want to start the next month. What do I do? And I think the kind of like funny thing, I was like, well, nothing has motivated engineers more than kind of like there's somebody who wants to use this and you need to build it in 3 weeks. And so, and then I helped them cut down the product a lot. And so and by the way, long story short, they actually got the product working in 3 weeks to serve the customer. And so they did 1 month's worth of payroll, about $1 million, even though they sold this person before they built the product. And how they did it was, as I like to say, we Wizard of Oz it. And what I mean by Wizard of Oz is the customer got a login to an account. It was the only account on the platform. So there was no actual login or registration flows. We literally hard coded their thing. And they uploaded, as part of the onboarding process, they uploaded a CSV of all of their employees and the dollar amounts. That CSV just went to the engineer, and the engineer manually entered it into the database. And then when the payroll actually came up, they just had a person send all of the money manually and then update the database. So they didn't actually have an app. What they had was a static website that basically looked like an app where they like changed all the stuff in the back and it showed up. And they did this for 6 months and the customer never knew. And by the way, the customer didn't care because the customer got what they paid for, which is I want to do payroll through crypto and I want to be able to get pay stubs and stuff. Your product is not the like app. Your product is solving the customer's kind of needs. And if you can do that for them, then there's kind of like no problem. So anyway, you can just sell people stuff and then work on it. There's a lot of pushback on this in Southeast Asia though. But Americans are kind of just like, yeah, whatever. It's so funny.
Yeah, I would be scared too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Pranav, did you do this when you were founder? Did you ever sell anything before you built anything?
Kind of. So I did have some co-working spaces that were just like fake doors.
Yeah.
And so once I knew they had interest in going there, then I just call up the co-working space and be like, hey, 5 people want to come to your space.
You totally faked it. You showed that you had a co-working space on your platform that you did not have on your platform. And then when somebody wanted to go there, you called them and were like, hey, you should be on my platform. Like,
and we had this thing where you could check in for the same day, but obviously we couldn't do that. So we made it a bug where you can only book a couple of days in advance. So that we had the lead time to quickly sell it or just buy it and pass it to them and sort of fix that.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is oftentimes kind of like customers actually don't move that fast. And so in the time it takes to onboard them, you can actually build the entire thing, which is hilarious.
For you, what skills will a founder have that will be successful in the future, in addition to the characteristics you mentioned in the modules?
The really important skills are kind of timeless. Like, I don't think there's any kind of like skills that are kind of like, ooh, this is a skill you're going to need, 5 years from now that you like don't need now, right? Like all the stuff around kind of grid and learning stuff and all of that are kind of like important. All the rest of this like skills, like honestly, like can you code? Can you like they're actually kind of like not. I mean, they're like useful, but I wouldn't say they're like particularly important. So I don't think there's any kind of like additions that are going to change in the future and how these kind of like what's going to make people successful. It's all the same stuff.
When people use spreadsheets to make databases, which became the basis for Airtable, does that count as actual usage validation method?
Fun fact, Jed, I don't know if you know, I know the Airtable co-founders. They're college friends of mine, so that I know them well. When people use spreadsheets to make databases, which became the basis for, I don't know if that actually was technically the basis for Airtable. And by the way, because I'm a dummy, for the 2 years that they were working on Airtable before like they launched, I had lunch with them once a week, and I basically told them they were being dumb and they should stop working on Airtable. Joke's on me. Their argument was Airtable is not like spreadsheets. And their argument was, I mean, obviously Airtable resembles kind of spreadsheets, but there's an obvious differentiation between Airtable and bases and kind of spreadsheets. if their argument is there's a difference, using spreadsheets is not kind of like is not kind of evidence that people would use Airtable. If you say that spreadsheets and Airtable are the same, then it could count as evidence, but then you run into the problem of like, okay, then your product is not differentiated, right? And so if you have sufficient differentiation, which you should have, then people using some other product that your product is different from is not evidence of kind of your product, right? You need to see if your product kind of like is real kind of like evidence. So yeah, no, I don't think so.
What are the best shots at reaching an 8-figure net worth from your experience? Just curious.
Best shots in terms of like what ideas to work on, kind of like starting a company, like what career path, like what do we mean by kind of like shots here? If this is you and you are okay putting it in the chat, put it that way. I was gonna make some snarky joke about like, why 8 figures? Why not 9 figures? Like 8 figures? I mean, gosh, come on, guys. I always kind of think that if you are marry a billionaire, if the best way to make a few $1,000,000, maybe kind of let me put it this way, is probably kind of working at kind of like hedge funds and all of this kind of stuff. Like, not like working at like hedge fund banks, not like DBS or something like that, but like proper kind of like that kind of stuff. And maybe kind of like McKinsey partner, like those will get you probably into the like couple of millions. If you wanted to get in the 8-figure net worth stuff, then you probably need to start something. You need to basically be working for equity. Actually, if you were an SF, the best way to get to an 8-figure net worth is just hop around kind of the latest, hottest startup and just hope one of them becomes like goes public. I have some friends who like, I think they worked at like Facebook, and then it was like Pinterest, and then it was Dropbox, and they literally worked at like 3 companies that eventually IPO'd, and it's like they have well in advance of kind of like 8 figures now. So if you're in SF, it's probably that. If you're in Southeast Asia, you probably have to start something, or you move to SF. I think that's probably kind of the like only way there. I mean, the snarky answers are be born rich, marry into a rich family, win the lottery, blah 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 blah, or whatever, right? But like, I think the only way to make 8-figure kind of like amount of money is you have to like probably have started something, and that thing has to be kind of like valuable to people in order to kind of like make that work, I think.
This person is just thanking us. So not a question, but thank you for the 3 modules. Gave me clarity that my initial startup idea was something I didn't deeply care about.
Hey, this is a very nice message, but I want to kind of drill down into this. This is a great outcome. Like, I think sometimes people kind of think about get to this and they kind of feel like a failure or whatever. Great, fantastic, like outcome. Like, this is awesome. The reason why it's awesome is I have some friends who started companies and then they got to this point, but they only got here after they had quit their job and after they had raised money. And then they were like, oh my God, I don't care. And by that time, you're kind of locked in. Like, if I quit my job on some idea that I think I care about, and then Pranav gives me $1 million for my idea, and then I wake up one day and I'm like, oh my God, I don't care about this idea. I took $1 million from Pranav. I'm now going to spend the next 3 to 4 years of my life working on this idea that I don't care about. That sucks. Like, please, like, as you know, if there's anything I can kind of like warn people off, don't waste your time on kind of like stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think if you are going through this module and you're like, hey, I don't care about my startup idea, that's fantastic. That also just means you can just find someone's other startup idea that you do care about, right? Like, there's so many startup ideas out there. Like, there's so many. It's like almost kind of like endless, right? And so, as long as there are problems in the world, there are startups to kind of be built. And so this is a nice message. I just really wanted to double down that I just think this is like a great kind of like outcome. And people don't talk about this probably enough.